All right, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to try to wrap our heads around, well, 10 major global humanitarian crises. We're actually basing this off a recent podcast segment and trying to pull out the key insights for you. We've got a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. Sudan, Syria, the DRC, the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Yemen, Haiti, the Central African Republic, and Pakistan.
Right. Well, what's striking is that while each of these situations has, well, its own set of unique circumstances that brought it to this point, there are some pretty powerful common threads.
Yeah, I see.
So we're talking about things like ongoing conflict, like really entrenched conflict, the growing impact of climate change, underlying political instability, and then also this sort of pervasive economic pressure that really amplifies the suffering.
It's like a perfect storm.
It really is.
And it's hard to even grasp the sheer scale of human need. I mean, we're talking about millions displaced, millions facing hunger, just struggling to survive each day. To understand these interconnected challenges, maybe we should zero in on one situation.
Okay, sure.
How about the crisis in Sudan?
Sudan's a good example.
This conflict between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, has been raging since April 2023, so we're coming up on its second year.
Yeah, and the situation is just, well, it just continues to get worse. This past February, we saw a really serious public health emergency. There was a huge cholera outbreak in White Nile State. I think something like 2,900 infections reported and 65 deaths. This is a direct result of this conflict because it completely disrupts these essential health services.
Right, it just collapses the entire system.
Absolutely.
And then you add on top of that, there's been this, well, they call it a catastrophic blow,
Yeah.
a significant reduction in life-saving funding from major government donors. And this just happened in March 2025.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. The UN did allocate $110 million from its Central Emergency Response Fund, or CERF, but, in early March. But it's just not, it's likely not going to be enough to make up for, that loss in funding.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the numbers as of February, there were an estimated 30.4 million people in Sudan in need of assistance.
Wow.
So that gives you an idea of the scale of the need.
That's a staggering number.
It really is.
Operation Broken Silence, they characterized this situation as, and I'm quoting here, the largest and most dangerous humanitarian emergency on the planet.
I mean, you can see why they would say that. Think about the devastation, especially in Khartoum, the capital, disruption to agriculture, skyrocketing prices for basic goods.
I can't even imagine.
And it's particularly bad for kids. Like, most schools are closed. We're talking 19 million children out of education. It's the largest childhood education crisis anywhere. The legacy of Omar al-Bashir's long rule, and then this kind of uneasy power sharing agreement that followed, it really set the stage for what we're seeing now. And of course, all this is kind of exacerbated by these regional power struggles as well.
So getting down to the root of it, what's causing this brutal civil war between the SAF and the RSF?
Well, I mean, there are these deep-seated issues, right? Political marginalization, huge economic disparities, and these things have been building up for a very, very long time.
And are there any other factors at play here that we should be aware of?
Yeah, for sure. There are some pretty concerning reports of external actors kind of, fueling this conflict, providing weapons, resources to both sides, which just prolongs the suffering.
Right.
It's also important to note that the historical marginalization of some ethnic groups, particularly in in Sudan's periphery, this has also added fuel to the fire, right? And it's created a base for these armed groups, like the RSF. So it makes any kind of lasting peace incredibly difficult.
It's a very complicated situation, it sounds like.
Very.
All right, so let's add it all up. We've got over 30 million people needing assistance, 25 million facing acute food insecurity, almost 9 million on the brink of famine. Then you've got this mass displacement, over 12.5 million people forced from their homes.
Yeah, and over 150,000 estimated deaths, at least. You also have to consider the impact on the healthcare system. It's essentially collapsed. 80% of facilities are offline. I mean, that recent cholera outbreak really shows you how bad things are.
It's a stark illustration.
Really is.
Well, the UN has launched a $6 billion appeal, and groups like the UNHCR and the IRC, they're working so hard to provide shelter, aid, and to respond to this cholera outbreak. But, the funding shortages are severe, and there are major access constraints, which makes everything really, really challenging.
For sure. And looking ahead, the long-term consequences here are really concerning. continued mass displacement, entrenched food insecurity, a wrecked economy. I mean, that funding cut could lead to even more deaths.
Right.
And then we also have to think about the trauma, the deepening ethnic divisions, and the risk of this spreading to the wider region.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's very concerning.
And even just in the past couple of months, we've seen that cholera surge, constant fighting, the alarming funding reduction, the UN's emergency aid allocation, and reports of SAF advances. Just one thing after another.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It really does.
And if we bring this back to the broader picture, the other 9 crises that we started with, what we see in Sudan, unfortunately, it's kind of a recurring theme.
I see that.
You see these refugee flows across borders, climate change making everything worse, economic and political fragility, kind of creating these ripple effects. I mean, take Eastern DRC, for example. That conflict is really all about competition over mineral resources. That's fueling the violence and the displacement.
It's all connected.
It really is.
It really underscores just the immense human suffering that's happening right now all over the world, and it highlights the desperate need for a strong global response.
Absolutely.
I think that's the key takeaway.
Yeah. We need more financial support, and we need real diplomatic effort if we want to find any kind of lasting solutions.
Okay, so final thought for our listeners. How do these conflicts that seem localized, and these environmental challenges, how do they trigger these global consequences? And what can we as individuals do to address these huge interconnected humanitarian challenges?
Yeah, it's something to think about.
It really is. Thanks for listening.